Okay, so you just responded to the second part of question 5. So noting the two key terms that Gladwell uses when he analyzes the example of the Greensboro 4. And on the slides, and again, I'll make these slides available to you on, right, that's week 2, that module under resources and handouts. So again, I've copied and pasted one of your responses to this question. So by this statement, Gladwell means you must truly believe in the cause you are supporting by making efforts to influence a change, not just liking or sharing a post on social media and thinking you are part of the change. Gladwell uses the Greensboro 4 to illustrate this claim by explaining the threats they faced each day. So repeatedly, Gladwell uses the terms high-risk activism and strong ties to support the actions of the Greensboro 4 protest. So those are indeed the two key terms that Gladwell uses the Greensboro 4 to introduce. Okay, so again, it's high-risk activism, and this is one way that this response could become stronger, right? So here, right, the threats that they faced, explaining or detailing what those threats were, right? So there were bomb threats, the KKK was threatening them. And so because of those risks, right, where they were actually risking their lives, that kind of activism that the Greensboro 4 participated in, and it's characteristic of the whole entire civil rights movement, is its high-risk activism, right? So again, you're not just donating 20 bucks, which does not risk your livelihood, does not risk your life. So this is high risk as opposed to low risk activism that we see on social media, according to Gladwell with his examples. Okay, and then strong ties. So here the writer does a good job of explaining and defining that key term, right? And again, that's one of our strategies for developing strong responses to quiz questions. And this is a strong strategy for developing successful body paragraphs, right? Be as specific as possible. Use those key terms to find them. Okay, so strong ties. So all 4 of the original members of the Greensboro protest had very close relationships. Okay, and we don't notice the writer doesn't just stop there, right? So the writer goes on to state what those close relationships are. How are they related? Okay, so they dormed together at college, and some of them went to high school together. Okay, so nice and specific. Okay, but most importantly, they were all driven by the same reasons. On page 6, it is mentioned that they would all have remembered the murder of Emmett Till in 1955, the Montgomery bus boycott that same year, and the showdown in Little Rock in 1957. Okay, so again, bringing in a quotation. So you want to make sure for each of your quiz responses, you're bringing in a quotation and using that as support for your answer. Okay, and so, I mean, this is a really interesting part, I think, of Gladwell's argument. So, in effect, he's describing close ties not only in terms of how strong your relationship is with someone or how long you've had this close relationship with them, but also in terms of the kind of memories that you would share that would make your connections to each other stronger, right? And so remembering together, and this is part of racial memory, right, of the African American experience, prior to the civil rights movement. So they would remember these instances of really brutal racial injustice, right? With Emmett Till, who was lynched. He was like a 13-year-old kid. And so these deeper motivations strengthen their strong ties even more. Okay, and again, a way to make this even stronger, in addition to what we've already talked about, define what high-risk activism is, and particularly this part of Gladwell's argument, the writer kind of mentions, but skirts over, right? And so the more accurate response would talk about what Gladwell is saying in terms of commitment to the movement, right? So essentially, he's saying that what he refers to as ideological fervor, right? And this will really be an opportunity with a hypothesis assignment when you're annotating what the heck is ideological fervor, right? So look up what is ideology, what is fervor. And what we find when we do that is it basically means kind of passion or commitment to an ideology or to a belief system, right? Or to, in this case, a social movement, right? The civil rights movement. And so commitment to the cause, passion for the cause of civil rights, of racial justice, actually wasn't enough to guarantee that people during the civil rights movement would stay engaged when they were faced with high risks, right? And so, you know, he gives the example of the Summer Freedom Project as demonstrating even more clearly how high risk this activism was, right? So during that particular project, during the summer, 3 volunteers who went south for the protest were kidnapped and murdered, right? And so again, they're really risking their lives here. And so the source that he brings in to kind of make this point says, okay, well, look, all the participants, all the volunteers were kind of equally committed to the cause, equally passionate to the about the cause of civil rights and racial justice, right? However, that itself, ideological fervor, commitment to the cause, was not enough to keep people engaging in high risk activism. And so that's when he poses the question, right? Well, what does keep them engaged in high risk activism that would make them stay instead of fleeing to somewhere safer, right? And so his answer to that question is strong ties. And that's where that key term comes in for the first time, right? So if you have these strong personal ties, you are more likely to stay engaged in activism that puts your life at risk, or your livelihood, right, or your job, something, right? And so the first kind of really important key term in terms of the Greensboro Four is high risk activism and then strong ties. Okay. Okay, so this brings us back to question 4, right? So again, what 3 key terms does Gladwell, or would Gladwell use to define what he thinks is true social activism, right? In his definition, so activism that challenges the status quo, that attacks deeply rooted social problems, right? Um, and so, as we can see from the Greensboro example, so one of those key terms is high risk activism, right? So true social activism is high risk activism, right? So the social media activism that's low risk, not true social activism according to Gladwell. Okay, another key term, well, in order to risk people's lives and livelihoods, real social activism requires strong ties to be successful, right? So you need strong ties to engage in high risk activism. Okay, and then from there, we move into the distinction he makes between hierarchies and networks, right? Okay, so in order for the social activism that engages in high risk and that is strengthened by strong ties as opposed to weak ties, like social media, friends, or acquaintances, um, what you have to have is a movement that's organized according to a hierarchy as opposed to a network. And that's where Gladwell gets into all of those word choices that I pointed out in the annotations to the article, where he's referring to war, right? So he talks about the civil rights movement was a war, right? That's the beginning of the article. And then he talks about the civil rights movement being organized according to a military operation, right? And so there's discipline, there's strategy, right? So all of those key terms reinforce the need that if you're going to attack the status quo is going to attack back, and you have to be prepared, right? Being a network is not going to cut it. You're going to fold. You're going to be infiltrated, as one of the examples showed, right? So you had to be ready for quote unquote war. And to do that hierarchy, you need central leadership. Everything needs to be structured, right? You need discipline. Okay. So those are 3 important key terms, and I have a slide here, and again, those slides will be available to you that his most important. So the most important key terms in Gladwell, and again, the most important of these are repeated over and over again, as we saw in the annotations to the article, um, are strong ties as opposed to weak ties. So high risk versus low risk activism, networks versus hierarchies, and then his distinction between participation and motivation, which is important, but I think not as important as the other three. Okay, and then more generally, key terms associated with the ongoing conversation he's engaging in, right? This larger conversation that includes all of these sources that he's bringing in, right? This conversation about how effective is social media in facilitating social activism. So we get the general key terms social media and social activism. And so as we'll see now that we're shifting over to who, she has those general key terms in common, right? So she's also engaging in the same broader intellectual conversation as Gladwell. How effective is social media in terms of social activism? Okay, and just quickly to reiterate then, again, the strategies for um, writing successful responses to quiz questions. So again, right, so answering in your own words, then supporting your response with a carefully chosen quotation, and then explaining how that quotation supports your point. And as you do that explanation, bringing in, explaining, defining relevant key terms, and also being as specific as possible. So bringing in some concrete details to make your answer nicely specific. Okay, so I look forward to reading your responses to those questions and to awarding you some extra points on the quiz. Okay, I'll see you guys later.